Good evening and welcome to Maclean's Live. My name is Paul Wells, senior writer for Maclean's. We're back doing this after taking the summer off, and we'll be doing these webcasts every 2 weeks until something happens and we can start doing them live. Tonight's a bit of a novelty. First of all, I want to say that we're grateful, as always, to our sponsors of the Canadian Bankers Association. That's not novel at all. What is novel is we're not live. I might as well admit that right off. We taped this afternoon because my guest, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Jonathan Wilkinson, will, at this evening, when you see this, be heading back to Vancouver, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Minister? Well, we're very glad to have you with us anyway. Yesterday was, if I count correctly, your third throne speech as a member of Parliament. Were you there? What was the experience like? It seemed like a strange day watching from a distance.
Well, it was a strange day, and I mean, it's been quite a number of strange days actually over the last number of months. But of course, you know, I mean, everybody is masked as we go up to the House and mull around, and there's obviously a bit more subdued. There's far fewer people than would normally be the case. Yeah, I mean, it's odd, but I mean, we're all having very odd interactions with people we know these days, right?
I have been reading through the spring and summer, since the lockdown began, that you and some other ministers were very active in advancing a strong climate agenda, following up on campaign commitments and some of the central mission of this government. What was in the throne speech that reflected your preoccupations?
Yeah, I mean, look, before the pandemic, we obviously were doing a lot of work on the climate file. We had committed to bring forward a plan that would demonstrate how we would exceed our 2030 targets, and we had committed to do that before we went to COP. And of course, COP was the climate conference was supposed to be this fall. So a lot of the work had been done pre-pandemic. And then, of course, with the pandemic, COP got moved by a year. There was a period where obviously everybody was sorting out how to get things done. And then there was a period of time where we had the opportunity to go out and have conversations with a whole range of folks, industry, environmental organizations, academics, about ideas that they had with respect to how we could best address climate change and perhaps how we might think about the growth phase coming out of the pandemic to help us with respect to some of the things that we know we need to do with climate. And I think that was reflected in throne speech. The specific, I think, language was that we will bring forward immediately an enhanced climate plan that will demonstrate how we will achieve and exceed our current 2030 targets. And I certainly think that's the product of a lot of thinking and a lot of work that's gone on. And I look forward to that conversation with Canadians.
If it's coming out immediately, you must have a recent draft of it in your office or on your laptop. Is it essentially ready to go?
I wouldn't say we're quite there, but we're pretty close. And certainly my aim is to be able to bring it forward before the end of the year.
Okay. Now, the goal here is to exceed 2030 targets. The 2030 target is a 30% reduction below emissions in 2005. And the last report that the government sent to the United Nations 10 months ago, in December of 2019, said you're still not there yet, that Canada's on track to be 77 megatons short of that target. Yep. Essentially, you'll have gotten 2/3 of the way to the 2030. You were on the way to being 2/3 of the way to the 2030 target, yep, but not all the way. Yep. And that's a really substantial difference. What's changed?
Well, what's changed is, look, I would tell you, and you would be well aware of this, I mean, the issues around climate change are science issues. They're not political issues. We actually know that the world needs to transition towards a net zero future, with the developed world getting there around 2050 and the developing world not that long afterwards. And in order to do that, you need to make substantive progress to position yourself in 2030 to actually move to get to net zero. We know we need to not only meet, but we do need to exceed the target. And so we need to go beyond the measures that were in the Pan-Canadian framework. Minister McKenna, who was responsible for the environment for the first 2 years, developed the Pan-Canadian framework in conjunction with the provinces and territories. And that identified 225 megatons of reductions. That's the by far the most comprehensive climate plan this country has ever had. But we still had more to do. And what the task that was given to me by the Prime Minister is to find those additional megatons to not only meet, but to exceed. And that is exactly what we are doing.
The report from last December said it was that the shortfall included measures that were in place or were envisioned. Essentially, you need to come up with new measures and a supplemental plan in order to be in range of meeting that. And in terms of specific new measures, the throne speech didn't really lay anything out that I heard. Now, throne speech isn't for that. Throne speech is supposed to be direction. What sort of stuff can you do on top of everything you've already done?
So it's either new stuff or it's accelerating work that was already underway and actually doing it faster, right? And certainly there were elements of this in the platform commitments that we made in 2019. So the planting of 2 billion trees and the home retrofits and a number of other things. But certainly we need to make more progress in all of the areas where we have significant emissions. And certainly some of that is in the industrial area, some of it is in the oil and gas space, certainly some of it is transportation, and a good chunk of it is buildings. There are lots of opportunities. I come out of the clean tech space. I spent almost 20 years running clean tech companies. There are lots of opportunities where you're not talking about building a new rocket ship. You're talking about implementing technologies that exist now and working with industry, for example, to get there. So cement and steel and a range of those industries that are high emitting sectors, there are pathways to make significant reductions and to get on a pathway to net zero. We need to partner to help to ensure that we do that. We need to partner with Canadians on buildings retrofits and on commercial building retrofits. And we need to accelerate the deployment of zero emission vehicles. There are lots of stuff you can do.
How much of an impact has the pandemic itself had? I keep hearing that nobody's driving, nobody's flying, therefore your work is done for you. But I don't believe I've seen numbers that would indicate the scale of that effect. Is it big?
Well, it's substantial in the short term, although I do think that banking on that to actually address the climate issue in the long term is not a thoughtful way to approach it. I mean, at the end of the day, many of these emissions are going to go back up as economies get back into motion. There may be some residual effects, more people working from home rather than driving and those kinds of things, but those impacts are unlikely to be significant. Even during the worst of the pandemic, global emissions declined by about 8%. And those have already started to tick back up as industry has come back online. So the climate plan actually needs a plan to reduce the sources of emission, to get at the sources of emission. We can't simply be banking on the fact that the pandemic had a short-term effect to solve our problem.
You will have read, as I did, that you were frequently meeting with your colleague, Catherine McKenna, your predecessor, who's infrastructure minister, and your new colleague, Stephen Guilbeault, who's heritage minister, but is a lifelong climate activist, to plan a post-COVID greener future. First of all, have you been? I read stuff about me all the time that I'm not sure is true. And secondly, why this little gang of three?
Well, certainly Stephen and Catherine and I have spent some time together, and Catherine has a wealth of insight having been environment minister, and Stephen has a wealth of insight having not only been an environmental activist, but having been a venture capitalist in the clean technology space. But I also met with Navdeep Bains, who is the Minister of Industry, and Mark Garneau in Transportation, and Seamus O'Regan in Natural Resources, and a range of other ministers who have a direct interest in the climate file. I mean, at the end of the day, when we're talking about addressing climate change, it's also about an economic strategy for the country going forward, which is to position Canada to prosper in a low carbon universe. And so it's all of us collectively coming to terms with how do we do that at the same time. As I say to you, I mean, I spent a long time in the business community, and I am not an environmental activist in the same way that Minister Guilbeault is. But I got into politics largely because I was concerned about climate change, even though I come from the business side of things. I think that my view is you've got to pull on the ideas that come from all of the folks that can help you, and that's a number of members of cabinet. It's not simply the three of us.
Okay. one of the easiest ideas, and honestly, one of the things that I thought would be nearly automatic in a second term or the second act of a Trudeau government, was that the carbon tax implemented at the end of the first mandate would just be increased. You get a compression effect on emissions as people try hard to avoid that tax. You just increase the tax and the effect increases. But I get the impression that's like not at all on the table.
Well, I would say everything is on the table. In the context of putting forward a plan, the focus is on exceeding our 2030 target. That would include considerations around price. It would include regulatory considerations, tax-related considerations, investment considerations. Right now, the price schedule goes up till 2022. We need to determine where it goes after 2022. There is an obligation in the Pan-Canadian framework to consult with provinces and territories, and we certainly intend to do that. But I will simply tell you, I mean, the price on pollution is the most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, you ask 100 economists, 99.5 of them will tell you it is the most efficient way to do it. If you're going to try to achieve the Paris targets, which Mr. O'Toole has committed himself to, and I commend him for that, and you're going to try to do that without a price on pollution, it's going to be really interesting to see how you put together a credible climate plan.
So again, if it's obviously the most efficient way to reduce emissions, and this is not a political question, it's a science question, then science tells me just increase the carbon price. Increase the rebates too, but that just seems the easiest way to go forward.
Well, certainly. I mean, if you were going to increase the carbon price, you would increase the rebates. I mean, the money is returned. And in fact, the majority of Canadians actually get more money back than they pay, as you know. So it definitely is on the table. As you would have seen in the throne speech, there was a recommitment to pricing pollution. There should not be a place in this country where it's free to pollute. And it is definitely part of the mix that we are working on in the context of the discussions about what the next plan should look like.
Okay. I asked about carbon pricing, and I've got some other, specific mechanisms I'm going to talk about, because a lot of the conversation over the summer seemed to assume that we can essentially move into this low carbon future and everyone will have fun doing it. It's cleaner trains and cleaner tech and cleaner building technology and so on. And that, and in fact, that was a lot of what I saw in the throne speech was that there's a cost-free path to meeting those emissions targets. And I admit I'm skeptical.
Well, I'm not sure that there's a cost-free path. I mean, in the sense that there are some areas where you are going to have to make some significant changes in terms of how we do things. But net, this particularly for countries that address this early, this will be a source of opportunity on a go-forward basis. And I would commend you to things like the recent Energy Transition Council report that came out, which is many of the largest organizations in the world, which actually go through how you actually get to net zero by 2050. And they would tell you it's virtually a cost-free path. Okay.
And yet the government, your government waited really until the last year of its first mandate before taking its most significant step, which was implementing the carbon price. And they seem to have tapped on the brakes even this year, that the throne speech was going to be a lot more bold new future, and instead it's a lot more protecting citizens. There seems to be a reluctance to take real action that produces a real change in the numbers. I don't need to tell you, if you met the 2030 target, you would be the first Canadian government to have met a carbon target.
So what I will tell you is wait for a few weeks. What you will see will be bold, and it will position Canada on a trajectory to exceed those targets. That is what I was told to do by the Prime Minister in my mandate letter. But fundamentally for me, from a personal perspective, it's the reason I'm actually sitting here in Ottawa rather than sitting back at home with my family. So it will be bold because it has to be bold. I mean, at the end of the day, climate is the crisis on the horizon. If we do not address it, the impacts will be far greater than what we're feeling from COVID-19. And so it is a science issue. And that means we do have to act, and we will.
Okay. One word that didn't appear in the throne speech was nuclear. Your colleague, Seamus O'Regan, said in a national forum last week on the Hill broadcast on the CBC, what he has been saying in front of industry audiences for some time, which is that there is no path to a net zero carbon future that does not involve nuclear energy. He's been citing some international reports. Is a greater use of nuclear energy part of your plan?
So I think Minister O'Regan is correct in the sense that there are areas of the world where there probably is no path to net zero without nuclear energy. So if you think, for example, about France, where 70% plus of the energy is actually generated by nuclear power, there is no pathway to 2050 without nuclear energy. Nuclear is a non-generating source. It's not renewable in the same way that solar and wind and geothermal are, but it is a non-emitting source. In Canada, of course, much of the electricity in Ontario is generated by nuclear energy. And on a go-forward basis, it's certainly part of the mix of non-emitting technologies that will be competing for the provision of electrical energy going forward. But it's going to be competing with solar and wind and geothermal and hydrogen and a whole range of other things. And it will need to demonstrate that it is both commercially viable, if it's an updated version of it, like a small modular reactor, and cost-wise. And I look forward to that competition. I mean, as you will have seen around the world over the last 20 years, the costs associated with wind and solar in particular have gone incredibly down. And the real barrier there is just storage. So, you know, it'll be a competition, and we will see the role that nuclear energy plays in the future. But certainly in some countries, yes, it will be fundamentally important.
Okay. A lot of people see those small modular reactors as being a big part of the future of the oil sands. Do you agree?
It's certainly possible. I mean, you know, as you will know, a big chunk of emissions in the oil sands have to do with the use of natural gas to create steam, to essentially create greater degree of fluidity in the bitumen. And so finding ways to get rid of the burning of natural gas to do that would help us with respect to emissions intensity. One option is small modular reactors. Another could be electrification in certain cases. It could be the use of hydrogen in place of natural gas if you're capturing the carbon from the reformation of the hydrogen. But so there are options, and that is one of them. And of course, you know, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Ontario are working on small modular reactors for exactly that reason, or for that reason and others.
So when Canada's natural resources minister says there's no path to net zero without nuclear, you're saying that may be true, but not necessarily for Canada, that we may not increase the total amount of nuclear energy production in Canada.
Right. It may be true in certain jurisdictions in the world. It certainly may be true in parts of Canada. I mean, where Ontario is concerned, I mean, moving off of nuclear power in a relatively short period of time would be incredibly challenging. And so it may well be true. It is certainly possible that you will see more nuclear being used in provinces like Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, who would like to have different sources of emissions. But we will see, because ultimately it will compete with other sources of energy, and the winner will be the one that can provide electrical energy at the lowest cost.
Okay. I mentioned the oil sands. I asked whether nuclear has a future in the oil sands. I might as well just shorten the question. Does the oil sands have a future in a world where you're trying to reach the targets that you're trying to reach?
Well, I think hydrocarbon fuels, whether it's oil or natural gas, certainly have a role to play through the transition. So, you know, I get asked all the time, why did the government agree to build a pipeline, and why don't you essentially require that the oil and gas industry, you know, be phased out in the short term? And there are a whole bunch of answers to that. But one is, this is a transition. To get to net zero by 2050, you know, it will take time. 3% of the cars being sold in Canada today are zero emission. 97% use gasoline. And so in the context of the continued use of gasoline, Canada needs to ensure that it monetizes the value of the resources it has. And that is why, you know, we continue to build the Trans Mountain Pipeline, for example. But in the longer term, I think what we need to do is be working with the industry on how can you continue, even in a net zero universe after 2050, to extract energy value from hydrocarbon resources without the carbon. And there are ways to do that. There are existing commercial ways to do that. There are new technologies that are being developed as to how do you extract hydrogen and leave the carbon in solid form. And those are kind of pathways where there is an enormous amount of opportunity for the federal government to partner with Alberta and Saskatchewan and British Columbia.
Is this where we get the notion of Alberta being a major manufacturer of car batteries?
Well, it's certainly possible. It could be a major manufacturer of a whole bunch of things. I mean, part of the work that they've been doing at Alberta Innovates over the last number of years is what they called bitumen beyond combustion, right? Which is, are there alternative applications for bitumen in a universe where combusting it is a problem? There are also pathways, though, as I've said, around how do you extract the energy value without the carbon, where you can continue to use it as an energy source. And there's a little company in Calgary called Proton, which is looking at, can you reform the bitumen underground and pull the hydrogen up and leave the carbon down? There's a little company in Vancouver called Econa, which is looking at, can you strip the hydrogen atom and leave the carbon in solid form from natural gas? Like, let's be creative here. I mean, at the end of the day, Canada has enormous incentive to try to find pathways to continue to actually extract value from its existing resources without carbon. The problem is the carbon. It's not the source of the energy.
Okay. What I hear from people in the oil sands is this is all great, but because there's a 2050 target, I still get to have a car, you still get to get driven to the airport after this interview, but someone making a decision about whether to invest in the oil sands today doesn't make that investment. And so the oil sands pay now for, and by extension, the entire Alberta economy, and therefore the Canadian economy, pays now for this zero net carbon future. Like that hurts in a lot of ways, including in the strength of the Federation. Is there a way to moderate that effect?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about where the investment community is headed globally, it is focusing increasingly on environmental issues and increasingly on climate. And you hear that from Larry Fink at BlackRock, you hear it from everybody. I mean, at the end of the day, what we need to be doing is working with producers and working with provinces and territories to make the improvements with respect to carbon intensity so that Canada is producing the least carbon intensive fuels, which actually makes it far more acceptable from an investment perspective, and that we actually have work ongoing to drive to these pathways of extracting energy without the pollution. And to the extent that we are doing that work, we will actually find ways to draw international capital into this. And many of the companies in Canada in the oil and gas sector recognize that. I mean, many of them have made commitments to net zero by 2050, including people like Cenovus and Meg Energy and others, Shell. And so I do think there is a way to do it, but it requires partnership. And this is a conversation I have with my counterpart in Alberta all the time is, we want to partner with you. These are the kinds of things we should be working on, because this is how we actually make progress. We attract international capital and we grow the economy on a go-forward basis. Having provinces and the federal government fighting about this doesn't help. We need to actually move forward.
Okay. There's all kinds of mechanisms for attracting foreign capital into large Canadian energy projects, whether it's the infrastructure bank, whether it's the sort of concierge service for international firms looking to invest in Canada. And yet the numbers haven't tended to follow. As a matter of fact, Canada's, in some circles, got a reputation as a place that's not worth investing in because it's hard to make projects go forward. There's squabbling among jurisdictions, the sort of rationale that led Teck to abandon its Frontier mine project. Is there a necessary contradiction between Canada being climate virtuous and Canada being a destination for investment?
No, and in fact, I actually think that it's entirely the opposite, which is, if we do not actually become leaders in addressing the climate issue, particularly as regards to the energy sector, we're going to struggle very much to attract investment. And so we need to be actually working and getting on the same page. Ultimately, I think we have the same interest as provincial governments in Alberta and Saskatchewan and British Columbia in terms of moving forward. But in order to move forward, we need to actually address the climate issue, and we need to be seen to be addressing the climate issue. And that is, the conversation I have with my counterparts all the time. Coming from Saskatchewan, I grew up in Saskatchewan. I worked for a premier in Saskatchewan. I think I have a reasonable understanding of the angst that many and the concerns that many people on the prairies feel. But at the end of the day, we need to actually say climate is real. We need to make progress. Let's figure out how we're going to do that in a way that's going to create prosperity for people who live in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia.
Okay. Are we going to see, I mean, it's funny, it's been such a long year. In the immediate aftermath of the federal election, it seemed like the biggest thing we were going to have to worry about over the next little while was federal-provincial relations. And then bigger problems came along to remind us of sense of scale. But I mean, at some point, is another First Ministers meeting on climate and energy something we can envisage? Like at some point, you're going to have to confront these contradictions in the Federation more or less directly.
Well, I think we are going to have to reach out and be having conversations. And often in the context of climate, I think these are probably more regional conversations than anything else. I think the next First Ministers meeting is probably on healthcare. Whether we have another one on climate, I don't know. We haven't made that decision at this point. But I do think that there is work that we need to do to try to find pathways to constructive conversations and to set aside some of the things that we don't agree on, like pollution pricing. You know, I saw Mr. O'Toole's comment about the Federation has never been more divided, and Chantal Hébert's comment this morning on CBC, which was he must have missed the two referendums. You know, at the end of the day, as you will know, as an observer of politics in this country, federal-provincial relations is always quite dynamic. I spent several years as a federal-provincial relations specialist for Saskatchewan. There is very rarely a time when there are not disagreements between the federal government and the provinces. At the end of the day, though, the test of federal-provincial relations is, can you find areas in which collaboration is possible, and can you park some of the issues on which you don't agree in order to make progress for Canadians? That's what we need to do. That is my commitment to Canadians and to my counterparts in the provinces and territories, and that's what I will be doing going forward.
Okay. The government seemed to take these tensions pretty seriously, though, when they made Chrystia Freeland Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs, and when she spent essentially most of the last quarter of 2019 parked in Alberta and Saskatchewan. You know, does a pandemic simply erase those tensions?
No, I don't think a pandemic erases those tensions, and the tensions, you know, I think are primarily around the climate energy nexus, as you have rightly pointed out. I do think that there are opportunities for discussions in areas where there's probably a lot more common interest than perhaps we have identified in the past, and some of it is definitely around technology. And so, you know, my hope is that we can actually find paths to more constructive conversations. I would also say that, you know what, I mean, you do hear sometimes different people in at both levels saying things publicly in the media and these kinds of things. But I would tell you behind the scenes, I mean, I have a good relationship with my counterpart in Alberta, Minister Nixon. I have a very good relationship with my counterpart in Saskatchewan, Minister Duncan. And I think, you know, behind the scenes, when we have issues, we typically reach out to each other and discuss them. Doesn't mean we always agree. I would also say that the biggest issue that has been a lightning rod is the price on pollution. I believe that issue was politically settled in the last election, when more than 2/3 of Canadians voted in favor of a price on pollution as part of an approach to addressing climate change. But, you know, the judicial process has now virtually come to a conclusion with the Supreme Court hearing over, and we will await the decision. But I do believe that assuming that the federal position is upheld, which I believe it will be, that issue can be put behind us and we can move forward.
The reason I asked several minutes ago about increasing the carbon tax is that I hear increasingly from climate activists that a sort of what they would call a simplistic price on pollution, a simple carbon tax, is not the best way to direct the development of a clean future. They say that, I mean, it smacks too much of letting the market do all the work, and they would rather regulate and subsidize, even if the you know, cost per unit of reduction is higher, because that way you know, we get to collectively make decisions about the development that we want, by which I think they mean government that gets to make the decisions about right. The development that it wants.
Right.
How do you react to those kinds of critiques from essentially your left?
Well, I honestly think there's a middle ground there. We've never said that a price on pollution is the only tool that we would use in the context of fighting climate change. There are other things that we know that we want to do. That the price on pollution over a long period of time might incent people to do, but it would take much longer. So for example, building out of a refueling infrastructure for either hydrogen or electric vehicles. It will be a while before there is enough of an incentive for companies to actually take that on, given that 3% of the cars that are being sold right now are zero emission vehicles. So we are using a number of different policy levers. One of them is the price on pollution. It does incent certain kinds of behavior, both industrially and on the part of consumers. Some regulations and both tax incentives and investments. And I think that's a prudent approach, is to actually not try to say there is only one instrument to getting this done. At the end of the day, what people want to know is the output. Do you get the megatons that you need to get to achieve the reductions that science tells us you should?
Okay. Minister, I want to talk about Bill Morneau, not simply to be mischievous, but because I immediately thought of the rest of the cabinet when he left. Because for 2 weeks before he left the cabinet, I was reading about private conversations that he had had with the Prime Minister, during which it was said there had been disputes over policy direction. And I thought, well, how the hell is anyone going to be a cabinet minister ever again in a world where they have no guarantee that their private disagreements with the PMO won't be reported by the PMO? Did that thought cross your mind?
Well, I think, some of whatever the leaks were, people who pretend to know something, who are talking to folks in the media about what they may or may not know. I mean, I think that's very unfortunate. And certainly I had a very good relationship with Minister Morneau. I did not think that was fair to him. And I think the Prime Minister is of the same view, that was not a fair nor an accurate portrayal of what transpired. At the end of the day, our job is, each of our job is to come forward with policy recommendations that are based on the analysis and the thought of our departments, of our consultations, and ultimately we are the ones who carry it forward. And sometimes that does involve robust conversations with our colleagues, and yes, at times with the Prime Minister. And at the end of the day, those conversations should be conversations that we can have without fear that they're going to appear on the front page of the Globe and Mail.
Okay. Although I just want to emphasize, it's perfectly okay if they wind up in Maclean's.
Fair enough.
Now, you said that in a few weeks I'll have something to report on. Is that very roughly, because many things can change? Is that the sort of timeline within which you want to release this plan for reaching 2030, for exceeding 2030 targets?
My aim is certainly to have something out before the end of the year.
Okay. That's well ahead of we've been mentioning COP, the Conference of Parties, the sort of semi-annual global summits of participants in the Paris process. That's well ahead of the next COP, I think. Is it possible that it could slide until closer to the next conference?
Well, it's certainly possible. I guess I can't guarantee, and of course, everything is somewhat subject to what happens with COVID-19. But I would say my aim, my intention, is to have something to bring forward to Canadians before the end of the year.
Okay, you're going to have to legislate some of that stuff. Is it going to wind up in a budget implementation document at some point?
There will be some elements. Probably less the 2030 plan, but certainly we have committed to legislation that would put in place binding 5-year increments to net zero by 2050. That was a promise we made during the campaign. That will require legislation.
Okay. And in the nature of things, I think that stuff would be the sort of thing that a minority government could fall over. How closely do you consult with the opposition parties in an environment like this?
So before COVID, I actually talked a fair bit to my counterparts in the other parties. Of course, during COVID, it's been a little bit more challenging, but I've certainly heard from my colleagues both in the Bloc and the NDP. Of course, the Conservatives have gone through a change with respect to who their critic is. And while Mr. Albus and I have exchanged letters, or I've just send him a letter. I haven't spoken to him yet, but I certainly hope to do that in the next little while.
Okay. Well, I think I've used enough of your time, and I think you've got a couple more of these interviews to do. So I think I'll wrap it up. I want to thank you, Jonathan Wilkinson, for introducing yourself to a lot of our audience who haven't got a chance to know you very well yet. And I want to thank you folks at home for watching, and we'll be back in 2 weeks and every 2 weeks with more of these Maclean's Live conversations, some of them live. And I also, as always, want to thank our sponsors at the Canadian Bankers Association for making these conversations possible. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you again soon.